My parents called it a family meeting, which already told me more than they thought it did. In our family, meetings were never about feelings, never about healing, and definitely never about honesty. Meetings were about control. They were about decisions that had already been made, where everyone was expected to nod along and pretend it was mutual. When my mother said the word closure on the phone, her voice soft in that rehearsed way, I knew something had shifted behind the scenes. People don't seek closure when they're satisfied. They seek it when they're afraid something is slipping out of their hands. The meeting was scheduled for a Sunday evening at my parents' house, the same house where every major family decision had always been announced like a verdict. My sister and brother were already there when I arrived, sitting side by side on the couch like this was a casual get-together, not something carefully staged. My father stood near the window with his arms crossed, staring outside as if he were waiting for something to arrive instead of me. My mother offered me tea, the same tea she always offered when she wanted to appear gentle without actually being kind. The room felt tight, like everyone had agreed on a script except me. They didn't start right away. That was the first sign this wasn't going to be clean. There was small talk about work, about the weather, about my grandfather's health, all of it circling the real reason we were there without touching it. My younger brother kept checking his phone, not bored but nervous. My sister avoided eye contact entirely. These weren't the behaviors of people coming to reconcile. These were the behaviors of people waiting for permission to exhale. Eventually, my father cleared his throat and said my name in that tone he used when he wanted authority without resistance. He said this meeting was about moving forward and putting things to rest, phrases so vague they could mean anything and usually meant nothing good. He talked about family unity, about how things had become complicated over the years, about how misunderstandings had grown larger than they needed to be. Not once did he say what those misunderstandings actually were, which was impressive considering most of them had been created by him. My mother took over smoothly, explaining that this wasn't about blame and that nobody was being accused of anything. She said we all needed to be adults about what was coming next. That word, next, landed heavier than the rest. My sister finally looked up at me then, and for just a moment her expression slipped. It wasn't anger or pity, it was calculation, like she was measuring how much I already knew. They told me my grandfather's condition had worsened and that decisions were being made as a family. They said paperwork was involved, responsibilities would need to be shared, and expectations had to be clarified before things became messy. My father emphasized that everyone needed to be on the same page to avoid future conflict, which was ironic because future conflict was clearly the only thing he was trying to prevent. The way he spoke made it sound like chaos would erupt if I didn't cooperate, like I was the variable that could ruin their careful balance. I listened without interrupting, which seemed to make them more comfortable. People mistake silence for compliance when they're desperate to believe they're still in control. My mother explained that certain documents would be handled internally and that it would be best if not everyone read everything, because legal language could create unnecessary tension. She smiled when she said it, the way people do when they're trying to soften a warning. My brother nodded along like this all made sense. My sister folded her hands in her lap, relieved. Then my father finally said it. He said there were things I didn't need to involve myself in anymore, that it would be easier for everyone if I trusted them to handle it. He framed it as concern, as protection, as if he was sparing me stress. But I'd grown up in that house. I knew what it sounded like when he was afraid. His voice always slowed down when he felt cornered. I realized something then that they hadn't yet realized themselves. This meeting wasn't about closure at all. It was about prevention. It was about stopping something before it reached daylight. They weren't asking me to let go of the past. They were asking me not to look too closely at the present, and the most interesting part was that none of them knew I had already seen the document they were so carefully dancing around. I didn't say that, of course. I just nodded, thanked them for being honest, and told them I understood how difficult things must be for them right now. Relief washed over the room immediately. My mother relaxed back into her chair. My sister exhaled. My father gave a single approving nod, the kind that meant he thought the problem had been handled. They truly believed the meeting had worked. As I stood to leave, my father reminded me casually that sometimes reading too much into paperwork only causes unnecessary pain. He said it with a smile, but his eyes didn't match it. I told him he was probably right. I told him I trusted him. That was when his shoulders finally dropped. What they didn't know was that trust wasn't the reason I was calm. I was calm because the decision they were afraid of had already been made, not by them, by me. And it was written in ink, signed, and filed weeks before they ever picked up the phone to call this meeting. They thought this conversation would keep me from opening something dangerous. They didn't know I had already read it, and they definitely didn't know what it meant for all of them once the truth came out. I didn't drive home after the meeting. I drove until the streets thinned out and the houses started looking unfamiliar, until I could think without hearing my father's voice layered over my own. The conversation kept replaying in my head. Not because of what they said, but because of what they avoided. Every pause, every softened phrase, every warning disguised as concern pointed to the same thing. They were afraid of paper, not memories, not emotions, paper. That fear hadn't come out of nowhere. It started 3 months earlier, the day my grandfather asked me to sit with him alone. He didn't ask gently. He didn't explain. He just said my name and pointed to the chair beside his bed, like time was something he could no longer afford to waste. My grandfather had always been sharp, even as his body failed him. He remembered dates, names, conversations from decades ago, and more importantly, he remembered who had stood beside him and who had slowly faded away once he stopped being useful. He told me he was tired of pretending everything was fine just because nobody wanted to argue anymore. He said sickness had a way of stripping away politeness, and he was done protecting people who hadn't protected him. Then he asked me a question that didn't sound dramatic at the time, but changed everything once I understood it. He asked me if I trusted my parents to handle his affairs fairly once he was gone. I didn't answer right away. That was my mistake. My silence told him everything he needed to know. He reached into the drawer beside his bed and pulled out a thin folder, the kind you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Inside were copies of documents I'd never seen before and letters I definitely wasn't supposed to read. He didn't stop me. He just watched my face as I went through them, like he was measuring whether I could handle what I was about to carry. That folder explained why my parents were suddenly interested in closure. It explained why my sister had been quiet lately and why my brother avoided conversations about the future. It explained why nobody wanted me asking questions anymore, because according to the most recent legal version of my grandfather's wishes, I wasn't just a bystander. I was a problem. My grandfather told me he'd changed his will after a conversation that never should have happened. A conversation where my father talked about him like a burden instead of a parent. A conversation where my mother suggested simplifying things by limiting who had access to decisions. A conversation my grandfather overheard while pretending to sleep. That was the moment he realized love in our family had conditions, and loyalty expired the moment it became inconvenient. He didn't want to fight. He wanted certainty. He wanted one person in the family who wouldn't rewrite history after he was gone. And for reasons I still struggle to fully understand, he chose me. He told me not to confront anyone, not yet. He said confrontation would only give them time to prepare defenses. What he wanted was for things to unfold naturally, legally, and without noise. He asked me to promise something that felt heavier than any promise I'd ever made. He asked me to promise that when the time came, I wouldn't back down just because it got uncomfortable. The next step happened quietly. No family announcement, no meeting, just a lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon, and a man who spoke slowly, carefully, like every word mattered, because it did. The lawyer explained the implications, the protections, and the inevitable backlash. He told me families rarely react well when control shifts without permission. He asked if I was prepared for that. I told him I'd been preparing my whole life. When I signed, it didn't feel dramatic. There was no sense of victory, just a strange calm, like stepping off a moving walkway and realizing the ground was finally still. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell my siblings. I didn't even tell my grandfather everything had been finalized. He didn't need reassurance. He trusted the process more than people. That was why the family meeting felt almost surreal in hindsight. They were trying to manage damage that had already been contained. They were warning me away from something that was already legally sealed. My father thought authority came from his voice. My mother thought control came from emotional pressure. They both underestimated how powerless those tools become once the paperwork is done. The hardest part wasn't keeping the secret. It was listening to them talk about responsibility and unity, like those concepts hadn't been selectively applied for years. It was watching my siblings play their roles, relieved that someone else was being guided away from the truth so they wouldn't have to face it themselves. What they still didn't understand was that this wasn't revenge. I didn't want to expose them. I didn't want to embarrass them. I just wanted the truth to exist somewhere that couldn't be erased or rewritten once my grandfather was gone. And now it did. The meeting wasn't the end of anything. It was the last warning sign before the shift they couldn't stop. And the next time we all sat in that room together, it wouldn't be about closure anymore. It would be about consequences. The first sign wasn't a fight or an argument. It was a small disruption, the kind people brush off when they don't want to admit something's wrong. My father mentioned the bank had asked for updated paperwork. He said it casually, like an inconvenience, not a warning. My mother complained that the lawyer hadn't returned her call yet. My sister joked that old men love to complicate things near the end, as if confusion was the only explanation that didn't threaten her sense of order. They were circling a problem they couldn't see. I stayed quiet, not because I was scared, but because silence was doing more damage than anything I could say. Every question they asked, every assumption they made, rested on the belief that things would continue the way they always had. That belief was fragile. It just hadn't cracked yet. My grandfather's health declined quickly after that, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow, undeniable one that forced the family to show up more often than they wanted to. Hospital visits became routine. Conversations turned awkward. Everyone started acting kinder, more attentive, like effort could rewrite the past if applied late enough. I noticed how my father positioned himself during those visits, always closest to the doctor, always the first to speak when decisions were mentioned. He acted like authority was something you could reclaim by proximity. My mother focused on appearances, bringing food no one asked for, correcting nurses over trivial details, making sure people saw her being helpful. My siblings played their own games. My sister suddenly wanted updates. She asked about medication schedules, about property maintenance, about documents she claimed to be organizing. My brother stayed distant but alert, like someone waiting for instructions he didn't want to ask for directly. None of them asked my grandfather what he wanted. They spoke around him, not to him. He noticed. He always noticed. One afternoon, while the rest of the family was arguing in the hallway about logistics, he asked me to lean closer. His voice was weaker now, but his mind was intact. He told me they were scared, not of losing him, but of losing control once he was gone. He said fear makes people sloppy, and sloppy people reveal themselves without realizing it. That same week, the lawyer called my father back. I wasn't in the room, but I heard enough. My father's tone shifted from confident to irritated to sharp in under 5 minutes. When he hung up, he didn't explain anything. He just said things were being reviewed and that nothing needed to change yet. That word yet lingered. At dinner that night, my mother watched me more closely than usual. She asked questions that sounded harmless, but weren't. She wanted to know if I'd talked to anyone recently, if I'd gone with my grandfather to any appointments, if I understood how complicated estates could become when people misunderstood intentions. I answered carefully, not evasively, just honestly enough to give her nothing. The more neutral I was, the more unsettled she became. She was used to reactions, defensiveness, emotion, something she could manage. Calm made her nervous. My sister tried a different approach. She pulled me aside later and spoke softly, like we were sharing a secret. She said, families fall apart over money all the time, and it would be a shame if misunderstandings caused unnecessary damage. She reminded me of holidays, shared memories, the idea of loyalty. She never mentioned documents. She never mentioned decisions. She just wanted reassurance that I wasn't going to disrupt anything. I didn't give it to her. By the end of the week, the atmosphere had changed. The confidence my parents carried like armor started to show gaps. They double-checked things they never used to question. They whispered more. They argued behind closed doors and stopped pretending everything was unified. The control they'd relied on for decades wasn't gone yet, but it was slipping, and people who are used to being in charge don't react well to uncertainty. They start pushing harder, speaking louder, asserting themselves where they don't actually have authority anymore. That's when the pressure started turning toward me. My father asked to talk privately. Not confrontational, just firm, like he was offering guidance I'd be foolish to ignore. He told me families don't need legal interference. He said trust matters more than paperwork. He warned me that lawyers complicate things that don't need to be complicated. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I thanked him for his concern and told him I trusted the process in place. His expression tightened, not anger yet, something closer to realization. The next day, my mother tried guilt. She talked about stress, about how hard this was on everyone, about how important it was not to add tension during such a sensitive time. She asked me to promise that I wouldn't make things difficult. I didn't promise anything. By the time my grandfather was moved back home under hospice care, the family had split into quiet factions. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew something was coming. They just didn't know when or from where. What they still didn't understand was that the moment they were waiting for had already passed. The decisions they thought were still negotiable had already been finalized. The authority they were trying to reassert had already expired. And soon they wouldn't be guessing anymore. The house felt different once my grandfather came home. Not quieter, but heavier, like every room was holding its breath. Conversations dropped when he slept. Arguments moved farther away but never stopped. Everyone was careful in the way people are careful when they know time is running out, but still hope it won't reach zero just yet. My grandfather noticed everything. He noticed how my father started taking calls outside, how my mother organized papers no one had asked her to touch, how my sister volunteered for things that gave her access rather than responsibility. He watched, without commenting, storing each behavior away like evidence. One evening, while the rest of the family argued in the kitchen about schedules and medication, he asked me to sit with him in the living room. The window was open, letting in cold air, and the house lights were low. He looked smaller than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp in a way that made me straighten without thinking. He told me that people reveal who they are when they think the ending is near. He said fear strips away manners, patience, and honesty. He told me he had watched this family operate for decades and that nothing happening now surprised him. What surprised him was how long it took for them to show it. He asked me if I regretted staying quiet. I told him no. I told him silence had given me clarity. He nodded and said clarity was more valuable than approval. He said approval could be withdrawn, but clarity stayed. That night, he asked for everyone to gather in the living room. Not urgently, not dramatically, just firmly enough that no one argued. My father looked irritated. My mother tried to smile. My siblings exchanged looks, already calculating what this might mean. My grandfather didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone. He spoke slowly, deliberately, like every word had been chosen long before that moment. He thanked them for being there. He said he knew his health was declining and that he wanted to address some things while he still could. My mother leaned forward, ready to take control of the conversation, but he lifted a hand and kept going. He said he was aware of the questions being asked behind his back. He said he knew people were worried about what would happen after he was gone. He said fear made people impatient, and impatience led to mistakes. My father interrupted, trying to reassure him that everyone just wanted what was best. My grandfather stopped him with a look that carried more authority than any raised voice ever could. He said what was best had already been decided, and it wasn't up for discussion. The room went still. My sister tried to laugh it off, saying this was stressful for everyone and that nothing needed to be settled right now. My grandfather turned to her and said that everything that mattered had been settled already. He said what remained was acceptance. That's when my mother's smile disappeared. She asked what he meant by that. Her voice was tight, careful, like she was bracing for impact. My grandfather said he had taken steps to ensure his wishes would be honored exactly as he intended. He said there were documents in place, witnesses involved, and instructions that could not be altered by pressure or persuasion. He said he trusted the people responsible for executing those instructions. My father asked who those people were. My grandfather didn't answer immediately. He looked at me instead, not with softness, with certainty. He said some decisions were made to protect the future from the past. He said love didn't mean equal treatment, and fairness didn't mean rewarding expectation. He said he had chosen based on character, consistency, and presence, not entitlement. My brother shifted uncomfortably. My sister stared at the floor. My mother finally asked the question she'd been avoiding since the beginning. She asked if this was going to change the family. My grandfather said the family had already changed. All that was left was acknowledging it. After that, the conversation fell apart. My father tried to regain control by asking logistical questions. My mother argued about tradition. My sister accused my grandfather of being influenced. My brother stayed silent, which said more than anything else. My grandfather listened until he was done listening. Then he told them they could leave him to rest. No argument, no debate. When they walked away, none of them looked at me. Later that night, my grandfather asked me to bring him a folder from his desk. Inside were copies of documents, notes, and letters written over years, not weeks. He told me everything was already in motion. He told me nothing could be undone now. He didn't sound bitter, he sounded relieved. Before he fell asleep, he told me something I haven't forgotten since. He said, power doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes when people stop needing permission. He said the family had spent decades assuming control without earning trust, and now they were about to learn the difference. The next morning, my father called the lawyer again. This time he didn't sound confident at all. The shift in my family didn't happen loudly. There was no explosion, no single argument that changed everything. It happened in small movements, in glances held a second too long, in conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Once my grandfather made it clear that decisions were already set, the house became a place of quiet panic. My father started waking up earlier than everyone else. He spent hours on the phone in the study, door closed, voice lowered but urgent. I heard words like options, contingencies, and misunderstanding. Every call ended the same way, with his tone tightening and his patience thinning. Whatever answers he was looking for, he wasn't getting them. My mother shifted strategies. She stopped pushing and started performing. She cooked meals my grandfather liked, played music he hadn't listened to in years, laughed too quickly at things that weren't funny. It wasn't affection, it was positioning. She was trying to remind him of a version of herself that no longer existed. My sister tried a different approach. She cornered me in the hallway one afternoon, voice soft, eyes calculating. She asked how I was holding up, said she knew this was stressful for everyone, said family should stick together during hard times. She spoke like this was a shared problem, like I wasn't standing exactly where she wished she were. I didn't argue with her. I didn't correct her. I just listened. The more she talked, the more obvious it became that she wasn't looking for peace. She was looking for access. My brother stayed distant. He avoided conversations entirely, burying himself in his phone or disappearing from the house whenever he could. He wasn't fighting, but he wasn't defending anyone either. It was the kind of silence that comes from knowing the outcome, but not wanting to be seen choosing sides. The lawyer called again 2 days later. This time, he asked to speak to me directly. He didn't sound surprised when I answered. He sounded prepared, like this was always part of the process. He told me there had been several calls from my father, increasingly aggressive in tone, each one attempting to challenge arrangements that were already legally secured. He told me there was nothing to challenge. He said the documents were airtight, witnessed, notarized, reviewed by independent counsel. He said any attempt to interfere now would only create problems for the people making them. He asked if I felt safe in the house. That question lingered longer than it should have. I told him yes, but I wasn't sure anymore if it was true. Safety wasn't about physical harm, it was about pressure. It was about the feeling that the walls were closing in while everyone smiled like nothing was wrong. That night, my father finally confronted me directly. No raised voice, no anger, just cold frustration. He asked what my grandfather had told me. He asked if I knew anything he didn't. He asked if I was influencing decisions that weren't mine to influence. I told him the truth. I said my grandfather had been clear, careful, and intentional. I said he didn't need my influence because he had already made up his mind long before things became complicated. My father stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Not as his child, not as someone beneath him, but as an obstacle. That was when I realized this was never about family. It was about control, and control was slipping. My mother joined us then, her voice trembling with restraint. She said my grandfather was confused, that illness could affect judgment, that people in his condition were vulnerable to suggestion. She said it gently, like concern, but there was accusation buried inside every word. I asked her one question. I asked when concern had ever stopped her from pushing before. She didn't answer. Later that evening, my grandfather asked to see everyone again. This time, there was no pretense. He was tired, but he was alert. He told them he knew what they were trying to do. He told them he was disappointed, not surprised. He told them that pressure only confirmed the decisions he had already made. My father lost his temper then. He raised his voice, accused my grandfather of punishing the family, of choosing favorites, of destroying everything he had built. The room shook with it. My grandfather didn't react. He waited until the noise stopped. Then he said something that ended the conversation completely. He said, "What you built was obedience. What I value is integrity." No one spoke after that. That night, I realized something important. My family wasn't afraid of losing my grandfather. They were afraid of losing what he represented: influence, access, power. And now that power was no longer within reach, they were unraveling. The next morning, the lawyer scheduled a formal meeting. That meeting would change everything. The meeting didn't feel real until we were all sitting in the same room, facing the same table, with papers laid out like evidence instead of conversation starters. There was no warmth in the air, no room for interpretation, no way to spin what was about to happen. This wasn't a family discussion anymore. It was a reckoning dressed in legal language. The lawyer arrived first, calm and precise, carrying a briefcase that might as well have been a verdict. He greeted my grandfather with respect, nodded at me, and acknowledged my parents like people he'd already studied. My sister tried to smile at him, the way she smiled at professors or hiring managers, but he didn't respond to it. He had no interest in charm. My grandfather spoke first. His voice was steady, tired but unshaken. He said he wanted clarity and finality. He said he was done with arguments and emotional leverage. He wanted everything stated clearly, recorded properly, and understood by everyone in the room. The lawyer explained the purpose of the meeting. He went through dates, documents, and signatures. He confirmed decisions had been made years earlier, revised carefully, and locked in long before anyone thought to interfere. He explained that nothing discussed in this room would change what had already been executed. That was when my mother interrupted. She said this felt rushed. She said no one had considered how this would affect the family. She said there were expectations, responsibilities, traditions. She said things had always been done a certain way. The lawyer didn't argue. He just said traditions don't override intent and expectations don't override consent. My father tried next. He leaned forward, voice controlled but sharp. He questioned the timing. He questioned influence. He questioned whether emotions had played a role. He questioned whether my grandfather was being fair. The lawyer turned to my grandfather and asked if he felt pressured by anyone in the room. My grandfather looked around slowly, deliberately. Then he said no. He said the only pressure he felt was relief because he had waited too long to stop pretending. That was the moment my sister lost control. She accused him of rewriting history. She said sacrifices had been made, that people had built their lives around assumptions he was now destroying. She said it wasn't right to pull the ground out from under family. My grandfather listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked her a question that silenced the room. He asked how many times she had visited him when there was nothing to gain. No one answered. The lawyer continued. He explained distributions, responsibilities, and boundaries. He explained who had authority and who didn't. He explained what would happen moving forward and what would no longer be tolerated. Then he turned to me. He asked if I understood what had been placed in my hands. He asked if I accepted it, knowing it would change my relationship with everyone in the room. I didn't answer immediately. I looked at my parents, at my sister, at my brother, at my grandfather. I saw fear, resentment, calculation, regret. And underneath it all, I saw something else. I saw years of control that had depended on my silence. I said yes. My father stood up so fast, his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He said this was a mistake. He said this would tear the family apart. He said people would talk. My grandfather responded quietly. He said people already had. The lawyer ended the meeting shortly after. There was nothing left to discuss. The documents were signed, acknowledged, and secured. Everything was now official. As we stood to leave, my mother tried to take my hand. I stepped back, not in anger, not in revenge, but in understanding. She wasn't reaching for me, she was reaching for control. My sister didn't look at me at all. My brother finally did, his expression unreadable, like he was watching a future he hadn't planned for unfold in front of him. My grandfather lingered behind with me after everyone else left. He told me he was proud, not because I won anything, but because I didn't flinch. He told me that silence can protect peace, but it can also protect abuse. He said I chose the harder path, and that mattered. When we left the building, my phone buzzed. Messages were already coming in. Family, friends, distant relatives, people who suddenly cared. The story was out, and now there was no going back. The fallout didn't happen all at once. It happened in waves, quiet at first, then loud, then impossible to ignore. What shocked me most wasn't the anger. It was how quickly people chose sides once they realized things had actually changed. Not emotionally changed, structurally changed. Power had shifted and everyone felt it. My parents didn't call for days. When they finally did, it wasn't to ask how I was. It was to ask what I planned to do next. Not because they cared about my plans, but because they needed to calculate how those plans affected them. Every conversation felt like a negotiation disguised as concern. My sister tried a different approach. She sent messages late at night, long emotional paragraphs about family loyalty, about betrayal, about how I'd forced my grandfather's hand. She talked about memories, about growing up together, about how we were supposed to stick together no matter what. What she never mentioned was accountability. What she never mentioned was how long things had been broken before I ever signed anything. My brother surprised me. He didn't take sides publicly. He didn't argue. He didn't defend anyone. He asked to meet me alone. When we did, he admitted something I never expected to hear. He said he had always known things weren't fair, but it was easier to benefit from it than to challenge it. He said watching everything become official made him realize how much he had ignored just to keep his position. He didn't ask me to fix anything. He just told me he understood now. That didn't heal everything, but it changed how I saw him. My grandfather stayed steady through all of it. He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He didn't explain himself to people who had already decided their version of the story. He focused on peace, on boundaries, and on finally living without emotional negotiations disguised as family duty. One afternoon, he told me something that hit harder than any argument. He said he had spent years believing keeping the family together meant keeping the truth quiet. He said he finally understood that keeping the family together at the cost of one person's dignity was never unity. It was sacrifice disguised as tradition. The extended family reacted exactly how you'd expect. Some people reached out in private to say they understood but didn't want to get involved. Some people stopped calling altogether. A few people tried to stir things up, repeating half stories, adding drama, turning it into entertainment. That's when I learned who valued truth and who valued comfort. My parents tried one last time to regain control. They invited me to dinner, acting like nothing had happened, like we could reset to the version of family that worked for them. I went, not because I expected reconciliation, but because I wanted to see it clearly one last time. The conversation stayed shallow: weather, work, neighbors. Then my father brought up the meeting again. He said mistakes were made on all sides. He said everyone needed to move forward. He said family should come before paperwork. I told him family should have come before manipulation. The table went silent. My mother cried. Not the kind of crying that releases pain, the kind that demands comfort, the kind that says, "Fix this for me." For the first time in my life, I didn't rush to do that. I let her sit with it. I told them I wasn't cutting them out. I was cutting out the version of family that required me to be smaller for everyone else to feel bigger. I told them they could be part of my life if they respected boundaries. If not, distance wasn't punishment. It was protection. They didn't like that, but they heard it. The real ending didn't come with a dramatic blow-up. It came quietly, fewer calls, shorter messages, holidays that felt different, a family that existed but no longer controlled the narrative of my life. My grandfather told me he slept better now. He said the house felt lighter. He said he wished he had done this years ago. I told him I was glad he did it when he did, because it changed more than paperwork. It changed the rules everyone had been living by. What I learned through all of it is something no one teaches you when you're raised: to keep the peace. Silence feels safe until it becomes a cage. Loyalty feels noble until it's used against you. Family feels permanent until you realize permanence without respect is just endurance. I didn't destroy my family. I ended a system that only worked for a few people, and the ones who were angry weren't angry because I was wrong. They were angry because things would never go back to how they were. I want you to stop for a second before you judge me, because from the outside, this story sounds simple. But when you're the one sitting in that chair, signing that paper, knowing it will change your family forever, nothing feels simple anymore. I didn't do this out of revenge. I didn't do it to hurt anyone. I did it because for the first time in my life, I chose myself over silence. But here's the question I can't answer alone. When family uses love as leverage, when they hide the truth and call it protection, when they decide your future without your consent, do you still owe them loyalty or do you owe yourself freedom? Some people will say I went too far, others will say I didn't go far enough. So now I'm asking you directly, if you were in my place, would you have done exactly what I did, or would you have stayed quiet just to keep the peace? Tell me in the comments, because how you answer says more about your boundaries than it does about my story.